Like, this guy's not being realistic. If I made an anonymous account, they still would not answer my questions about Popper. They do not have discussions to conclusions and actually try to thoroughly resolve people's doubts and arguments and whatever. They don't have a forum for doing that, like literally don't have a discussion forum. They do not follow up on tweet threads reliably. There aren't very many of them. It's not very diverse. There's just a few people who are all Luli friends and fans. And there's no organization. Like, it's not really even a community. You would think that if this was really happening and to some meaningful extent, David would be aware of it. Some of them would contact David or contact someone who knows David or something. There'd be some way for the information to get back to him. But that certainly was not happening in the past, because David would have told me. We did talk about what people existed, who contacted him, etc. And the short story is he was dissatisfied with the response to his ideas. Like, in David's opinion, those things were not doing well. Also, none of those things are trying to be a living tradition in the sense that was in the discussion, like earlier. The thing being talked about, a thing you can engage with to actually get answers to your questions, and something you can like join and learn the ideas from. Like, if a book club has some discussions about a DD book, that's completely different than having access to multiple living experts who can answer your questions so that you can learn the material correctly instead of incorrectly. It's not the same sort of thing. Anyway, if he would actually link any material that he endorses, then we could criticize it. He would be sticking his neck out. That's why he didn't, I think. This groups other people into one group, but there's lots of different other people with different goals, preferences, values, etc. Like, does he get along with 0 people? Does he get along with, 1% of people, 2% of people? Because that can be plenty. Like, how many friends do you actually want? There's a lot of people in the world. If you live in a big city, there could be like 100,000 people there. So if you get along with 1% of people, there's like 1,000 potential friends in your city. Some places have more people than that. Even if you live in like a small town, like 1,000 people, and you get along with 1% of people, you could have like 10 friends. Is that enough friends? Maybe. I mean, how badly do you get along with other people? I assume you can get along with them just fine when they're a cashier and you're a customer. I wonder what kind of context this is, because like strangers don't normally say that to you during small talk. Even if you do it badly, those would be like odd. Especially this one. Like, is he trying to be friends with people, or are these his friends, but he has friends who don't like him very much? Is this his family? Like, this sounds like something your mother would say to you. Potentially. Well, these books, like Girls Chase, say how to achieve social values. Just because they have specific examples related to romance doesn't detract from their value in general, and also, it sounds like romance stuff is relevant to him as well, anyways. This is so vague, like, which things? I've never been married or... Like, I've read a lot of this stuff, and not much of it has been about marriage or divorce. These are not common topics. Like, there's more stuff warning about the dangers of what women could do to your life than saying they actually had their life ruined by a woman, from what I've seen. But also, like, even if that hasn't happened to you, it's like a warning, this could happen to you. That's important information just because you haven't had very many relationships. Like, he's sort of saying, it hasn't happened to me, therefore I'm safe. And like one of the main points is you're not safe. These kinds of relationships blow up all the time. And society's reaction when they blow up is frequently very biased in favor of the woman, so you can have a bad time as a man. Right, it's not that hard to be like boring and bland, and most people like are not going to complain if you're boring at like a water cooler or whatever. You can get away with being boring. It's kind of expected. Well, it could happen more. One of the points of the manosphere that's very important is all women are like that. Now, you can say approximately all, and that maybe 1 in a million women are different, but the vast, vast majority of women have common themes or patterns that they follow. So, it doesn't matter if you have a different situation, because the women you meet will all have some of the same standard themes of what women in our culture are like. And not just our culture like America, but you can see the same themes in other cultures, in Poland, in the UK, in Japan, etc. Not identical, but a lot of overlap. this guy has poor social skills, but then he complains that a lot of the material that helps with social skills also helps with dating stuff. And his complaints are very vague and do not seem to be talking about the same websites that I've read. Like, when I read them, I did not get the same impression as him, and he's not giving details. This sounds like he's one of the people who desperately needs red pill stuff so he can stop getting fucked over. You don't have to play the game, or like the game, for it to be worthwhile to understand the game and know what the rules are. Being ignorant of the game will not make it disappear from the world. It won't stop women from playing it. You need to know what the game is in order to understand what your options are and make a reasonable choice about what to do about it. Just burying your head in the sand won't get you anywhere. It doesn't have to be that way, like in theory, but it is that way today in general. It's certainly not the only objectionable thing in our culture. Like, you could complain about politics. Why does it have to have such superficial sound bites and no real debates and choosing between two bad options for who to vote for? Why does a network like CNN get to host debates and have like biased moderators who leak questions in advance to Hillary or whatever they did? I forget the details. Like, politics doesn't have to be so fucked up, but currently it is. You can say the same thing about like schools or parenting. You can imagine a better world where parents are less tyrannical and cruel to their children, or schools are less coercive and more useful. You can lament the current state of the world. I mean, there's lots of problems in the world. If you want to fix something, that's a great project to work on. Most people don't know how to fix it. Most people who complain about those problems are part of the problem themselves. They don't actually know enough about it to know how to improve it, what would be better. And they do a lot of it themselves without realizing it. It's a lot easier to be a critic, to like point out some things that could be better, than to actually do better. Because you have to make changes without like screwing something else up if you want to improve something. So when people actually have to put forward their own ideas about what's actually good and see if that stands up to criticism, they often fail. But when they're not putting forward any ideas, any alternatives, they're only attacking the status quo, then they have an easier time finding some things that are genuinely flawed. Like, they'll still point out some non-problems, but a lot of people can find some real problems in the world. That's part of what happens with the left. The left complains about America, about American culture and American traditions and Christianity and stuff, and while they're wrong about some points, they certainly have some legitimate complaints. There's a lot of things about the status quo that are imperfect that people actually manage to notice and see something's wrong there. Their ability to actually make anything better is a lot more questionable than their ability to critique. If you wanted to change dating dynamics and how women live, you would need to understand what are the incentives for women, what's their childhood like, what causes them to be the way that they are, and what is the entire process, and what sort of things could change it. And that means things like questioning and rejecting a lot of current parenting practices that people do not want to oppose. Like, most people think that crying a lot is just part of childhood. Children cry, that's just normal and natural. So they don't want to take seriously that crying is a problem. It's an indicator that something's wrong, and that parents ought to do more to help their children. And if you will not accept that, you have no business complaining about the results of that parenting, the practical consequences of which include female behaviors that people don't like, or at least that like manosphere people don't like. Most people are fine with current female behaviors, but there's a group that objects to them. I think that it's very, very dangerous today to accept mainstream philosophy and not be a philosopher yourself and just try to build on top of standard philosophy ideas and do your own field. I think you cannot rely on the foundations that you just pick up. You can't say, I'm just going to assume that the philosophers got everything right and then do my work on that basis. because they did not. A lot of stuff is wrong. And it's similar with some other things, like you cannot rely on mainstream economists or mainstream climate scientists or mainstream psychologists. Like all of those fields will spread a significant amount of misinformation. And even in some of the more isolated fields like math and physics, you see philosophical errors causing huge problems. So, I think that if you wanted to specialize, the only field that makes sense to specialize in is philosophy. You could be a philosopher only and like ignore the other fields basically, and just focus on internal philosophy issues. I wouldn't really recommend, like you don't want to be like super ignoring the world in ivory tower. Like, because applying philosophy helps you learn it better and understand it and see what actually works. Like, you want to check your philosophy in reality. So, if you're going to specialize in something, I'd say philosophy, because if you don't specialize in philosophy, if you specialize in anything else, you're relying on other people's philosophy. So, I think everyone ought to study philosophy, so it's the only candidate to specialize in, but basically, I think polymath is better. You can, like, somewhat specialize. Like, maybe you could spend 80% of your time on one thing, but I don't think you should like super specialize. You ought to be like reasonably skilled at a lot of stuff. Roark was a very good thinker. He was a philosopher who disagreed with a lot of cultural ideas. He didn't have formal training, but he was a better philosophical thinker than anyone else in the book. I think he would have been better off with a bit more like explicit study of philosophy. Maybe he did it earlier in life. It's not super clear. So, one of the things about Roark is that he worked in the building trades. He can handle a torch. He's not just a man in a suit who can only work in an office. He can work with like a jackhammer and a granite quarry. So that shows a lack of specialization in some ways. That he's actually familiar with a lot of different stuff, and he's got good familiarity with the whole process. And that includes like the architecture, but also understanding building materials and building tools and, you know, carpentry skills and that kind of thing. And also, he does know the part of the process where you question the Parthenon instead of just copying it. He is good at that part, even though we don't see his learning process for that. Roark was certainly not just accepting mainstream culture for how to think in epistemology and stuff, but that isn't really covered in the book. I do think it would be a bit better if, like that time he's sitting around in his office waiting for a phone call, he ought to be, you know, reading through a pile of library books, including philosophy books. I think that would make more sense and be a more reasonable activity. He shouldn't just waste time waiting. He can brush up on a variety of things and, you know, explore to find some good ideas, and especially if he got to the point that he was like tired of sketching more or something. What you want to do that young. Some of her heroes do know. Like, she finds that impressive that they've figured a lot out so early. But like John Galt changes course. He thought that he wanted to be a physicist and philosopher, and he went and worked at the motor company, and he thought that he would have like an inventor type of career. And then, you know, they have the meeting, and he quits, and he leaves, and he changes the course of his life, he changes his career, he does something different. Not entirely, he still does his original career, but it becomes less of a focus, and he has this like major alternative project. So he ends up changing what he does. And Francisco is the same. He had a vision of what his life would be like. He had a plan, and he was pursuing it, and then Galt changed his mind, and he rethought things and made major changes to what he was doing. And Ragnar Danajaskald is the same way, where the piracy stuff was not his plan A. Dagny, a main part of the book, is her struggle to change plans. She doesn't want to let go of Taggart Transcontinental. But in the end, she needs to change plans. And also, specifically in Galt's Gulch, all the people there have multiple jobs. That's something that's commented on in the book, that everyone there has like a second profession. You get like airplane mechanic plus hog farmer or something. I forget if that's the right pairing, but a lot of those people had two jobs. They were good at two different things. And you see Hugh Axton working in the diner. He's capable of cooking food well. And there are some comments in the book about how the good people can do not only their job, but also the job of the men under them. I think that's something kind of like that. So there's a standard view of a polymath, and it includes caring about, like, quote, culture and, like, literature, famous books, and, like, learning at least one foreign language is part of it, and, like, going to the theater and caring about music, maybe classical music or something. And I'm not a big fan of that specific vision of a polymath or cultured intellectual. And Rand certainly wasn't either. She has scenes with like dinner party type things where you get those kind of people talking parties, and they're terrible, they're the villains. And you know, the people making the scenes tend to be the leaders, but the followers aren't so good either. So you have to be careful with that term. And I think, but it's good to survey like the main important stuff. Rand herself was interested in learning math, and I've heard this somewhere, I forgot where, but that she wanted to study math late in life. And I think she started doing that. She wanted to know more of the technical details of stuff. I think it's good to have a decent grasp of math and physics and, you know, all the major fields, economics, how science works. And you see that from some of her characters, like a John Galt or a Francisco. They don't just know philosophy narrowly construed. They didn't just study Plato and Aristotle and Aquinas and Descartes or whatever. They, as part of their philosophical understanding and their intellectual activities, they understand economics as well, and some stuff about psychology, and which is how I've always viewed philosophy, is that you should apply it, and part of the point of principles and ideas is that they have applications, and they mean things in particular contexts, like parenting or education or whatever, which are areas Rand commented on a bit. Like, she had some opinions there. She knew philosophy applied to it, even if she didn't focus on it a lot. It depends on what your goals are with the girlfriend. One option is to recommend philosophy discussion forums to them, which is sort of what I would do with any person that I had much interest in. If they want to learn on their own initiative without being pressured or guided, you know, if that's something that appeals to them, if they have their own motor, that's great. And if not, that's not terribly interesting to me. A lot of people, and you see this like extra with girls who are doing courtship, are kind of suck-ups, and if you like are pushy about an interest, they'll pretend to share your interest more than they do and get involved a bit, and then it won't last. Especially if you break up, then they'll just stop doing it. You don't want to be like dating someone where if you broke up with them, they would no longer be interested in objectivism a year or two later. They're only doing it because of you. You want someone who's genuinely interested in learning, and like they would continue no matter what you did. And so you don't have to like remind them all the time. If it's like a constant struggle where they forget to do it, or they're always busy and just can't find time for it, things like those are bad signs that show lack of interest. There are other aspects of this question, like, you know, if you want to be attractive to them and get them to like you in conventional ways so you can have sex with them, then there is good advice about that here. You can also use this for the purpose of just not ruining it, like not doing something that's so conventionally offensive that it would alienate almost any woman. Because a woman can be like particularly intelligent and actually interested in learning, but also have some weaknesses and get offended by certain antisocial behavior or whatever. And so having an understanding of what the dating rules are can help you avoid like major fuck ups that could alienate someone who's even pretty good. Well, I would say try not to make an investment where you're sacrificing or, it's bad for you in the short term. Try to have interactions where you're not going to regret it no matter what happens because you're benefiting in the short term right now. Do things that are good for you now. Like right now, I'm answering questions on my stream. If you or Evan never comes back, I'm not going to be like, I wish I hadn't streamed. It's fine. I'm making content for my YouTube channel. I'm having a pretty good time, so I'm not too worried about it. It's low risk. Like it's not a major investment. It's not high cost for me, and I'm getting benefits from it right now, like entertaining myself or thinking about things. I think that you're a bit overly focused on teaching, and you ought to be more focused on writing down your ideas and exposing them to criticism. Like, make a blog and write some articles and see if you can actually write stuff that me and Justin and whoever don't see a bunch of things wrong with and don't have arguments against. Well, okay, then he should make a blog or whatever. I think it would be more appealing to the woman and better life advice if his attitude was not, he's better than her, he knows the answers and she doesn't. But instead, you both are at the beginning of infinity, there are many, many things you both don't know, and you're both going to try to learn things. That would be a better attitude that's more equal. Like someone else to go on the journey with is more suitable for a romantic relationship than someone below you that you just want to teach them so that they're good enough that you can not reject them. If you want to find someone really smart, you probably shouldn't be going to the bar or the club or whatever and hoping that the people you find there will be super smart, especially the women who, tend to know less and be less interested in ideas than the men. I think a lot of people who think they want a really smart woman, like they overestimate themselves and they're like, I'm amazing, so I need a girl who's super amazing, and they're not as great as they think they are. If you get a girl just for sex and you tell her, if you're upfront, if you don't mislead her, and she's into it and you're into it, I mean, it's not my favorite thing, like, but I don't think it's, like, particularly bad or anything. Like, I don't think you're hurting her if she knows what's going on and you're not tricking her and you're not lying to her, and she wants to do it. A lot of girls think sex is fun, and if you play the role correctly, if you do the right actions and behaviors and whatever, then they'll think you're a suitable sex partner. You're doing it correct in their view. So it's fun for them and they want that. And I think that pursuing that, you can learn that, if it's empty, as some people claim it is, you can learn that it's empty. You can find out more about it in detail. Like if you just don't know how it works that well, you haven't tried it much, it can be hard to just stay away because by reputation you heard it's empty. Whereas you find out in more detail what the game is, what you have to do to get women, what's actually optional and what's actually required. But you can find out how oppressive or tyrannical you find it to be, how much work it is, how much you have to go out of your way, how compatible it is with your normal personality and normal values, etc. Like you can test that stuff and find out where the boundaries are and what works, and etc. And you may decide, once you know more about it and you've tried it a bit, that you don't like it and it's not for you. And that learning experience can help you get over it as opposed to just like, wondering and daydreaming for years and years. For a lot of people, they really want that kind of thing. And it's hard to just, pass it up just because some people said there may be some problems with it. And so for those people, instead of just wanting it and being bad at it, it would be better to put some serious work into it, get good at it, and see how it goes and try it out. And developing a skill, getting really good at something, is a good experience to have. It's good practice to learn something and to find out what high quality knowledge is and how to change your mind and correct some of your errors, which are any learning project, including including the project of how to be a player or whatever, can be done in a serious, thoughtful way where you get good value out of it. Most people don't do it that way, but it can be done that way. And a lot of people, they find when it comes to like philosophy and like writing a blog and reading Rand and whatever, they're not that motivated. They don't spend a ton of time on it. They're not super enthusiastic. And so if sex is what motivates you, and that is what will get you to actually put more time and energy and effort into learning something, that can be good. Like, use your existing values and interests so that you're actually motivated instead of having a half-assed life. In general, if you're doing things effectively, you can finish with them faster than people think. Just like with the grammar stuff, where I found once I looked into it that it was simpler than people think. It wasn't as complicated as they think. You can actually like learn it and be sort of done, and it doesn't take super long. It's the same with girls and sex. You can focus on it and excel in stuff, and it doesn't have to just take up your whole life being promiscuous. It could be like a phase for a couple years, and you got really good at it, and you know all about it, and then you're like, you know what, it's time for a new project, and I saw how getting highly skilled at something worked, and now I'm going to try it with something else. So it can lead to good things, potentially. It can be like a second-handed pursuit, but if you have those values, if they're already inside you, taking them seriously and taking them to their conclusions is a way to address them and deal with them, rather than just leaving them as like half of what you are, but you never like look at it too closely and it just stays the same. Like if you actually pursue it and make progress and change, that is better than half ignoring it and half pursuing it. You never really get anywhere, but it never goes away either. If it's really second-handed what you're doing, if you take it more seriously, you may find out about it and see in detail what's wrong with it. You might learn to what extent women are sex bots who respond to certain inputs according to their programming, and you might start seeing that as empty, and there's no reason to pander to them or please them, or at least not to care what they think. Like, you could fake it to get what you want from them, but you might start seeing them as being empty-headed in certain ways. You might find some of their reactions and behaviors very predictable. And once you start predicting what they're going to do, and you're like, well, if I say this, she's going to do this, and so on. And the more you get total mastery of the situation, you might get less second-handed about it and stop worrying what she thinks of you, and feel more confident and think that getting her good opinion is not something you should worry that much about. It's just something you can have when you want to, when you feel like doing what she likes, but you don't have to have like the normal perspective on it where you just want approval and to be liked or whatever. Like, because a lot of people are sort of desperate for approval because they don't know how to get it. They're bad at it. They've never had it. And if you can have it whenever you want just by following a script, once you get that skill, it seems like less of a concern. It's easier to violate the rules because you can get approval when you want to, so who cares? Like, you're not going to value it that much when you know the script that gets it, and you know how unintellectual that script is, and so on. Spreading your values is good. Like, I approve of that as a goal. In the big picture, though, the question is, like, how do you spread your values? What is the best method for spreading them? And I think that starts with error correcting your values a lot. Figure out what your values actually are. Like, you don't want to spread your values and then change your mind and then spread your new values and then change your mind again and then spread your new values again, and so on. So you want to like really know what you're doing. And you have not so far exposed your values to public internet criticism. You have not written blog posts saying, these are my values that I think I should spread. Does anyone know anything wrong with them? Any reason why I shouldn't spread these values? You haven't gotten that kind of critical feedback, which I think makes it early to be trying to spread them, because people might know reasons that you should change your mind that would convince you, but you just haven't checked yet. So I think that is one of the major bars or prerequisites or hurdles that you should pass, is soliciting criticism, seeking out criticism, and seeing if anyone knows why you should be doing something differently, or spreading different ideas, or spreading them in a different way. Like maybe the way you explain things isn't great, or maybe it's great, I don't know. But you could write some sample explanations and see if anyone has commentary. But it's more important to spread your values effectively and to focus on that than to rush to do it immediately. Like rushing to do the wrong value spreading is what millions and millions of people do when they say volunteer for a Democrat political campaign. A lot of people, like, they read stuff like Rand and they think their ideas are similar to what they read, but then when they actually say stuff, there's often errors. And so it's important to say your own version, like, because you want to spread it, so you're going to be the one talking when you spread it. You want to actually make educational materials or whatever. So if you're going to be making those, you should make some initial ones and ask for criticism on them, and like argue your case and whatever, and see if anyone has counter arguments. There's also questions like, what is the best method or medium for spreading your values? Like, should you make YouTube videos? Should you make essays? Should you write books? Should you talk to people in person? Should you give lectures in person? Should you go on a stage in person and do a debate with someone? Should you do an online debate with someone? In what format? Like podcast, video, real-time asynchronous, text, etc. What kind of discussion forums are effective or ineffective for what purposes? There's a lot of stuff to know like that. Books are very long. I may write some, but like the goal for me primarily is learn more and try a lot of things in less committal ways. I tend to try things that are good for me in the short term, like because my focus is more on benefiting myself rather than changing other people. And I've been gradually moving that in the direction of sharing more and trying to help other people. Like, the better you get, the easier it becomes to make material that's helpful to other people. So I've been increasing how I do that. So you could have taken me like 5-10 years ago and said, that I know a lot and that I should spread it, and I certainly did some things to spread it, like I blogged and whatever, but like I wasn't seriously focused on outreach and getting in front of as many people as possible. Because, for example, I do not know a great way to take one person and persuade them a lot and help them become really good. And also, compared to 5 or 10 years ago, I've learned a lot more, like I'm wiser. So I've been improving and changing. And so the more my rate of change slows down, which is something I don't particularly want, but it's hard to avoid, then the more reason I have to spread my ideas because they're more stable. But I'm still trying to figure out what will actually work well, because that's a very, very hard problem. I think most people trying to spread ideas don't have much respect for how hard that is and how ineffective most attempts are. And a lot of people spend a lot more time trying to spread ideas than actually trying to get the right ideas and to double check that their ideas are right and respond to criticism and so on. The idea of learning through experience is refuted by David Deutsch in his book, The Beginning of Infinity. He criticizes empiricism. This is part of popular etymology in general. So if you're interested in learning about philosophy, Bubba Beans, you should go to this page. You go to fallibleideas.com and then you go to books. And then look at these books. And in particular, the ones most relevant to what you're saying are the ones by David Deutsch and Karl Popper. Broadly, people are not going to improve or learn or whatever on my initiative as the primary thing. People have to have their own motor. When you want to spread your ideas, you have to be in a helper role. They have to be driving their own learning, taking the initiative, pursuing things themselves. And the teacher, the educator, has to be secondary. And a lot of teachers don't realize that, and they think that they're sort of in charge. And that's one of the problems with school in general, is the lecturers think that they're the ones sort of running the interaction and running the show. And for learning to be effective, the learner has to be running their own show, doing their own learning process, and using your stuff to help them. And so a lot of material that's trying to do outreach and education, whatever, focuses on the students are not that interested, and they need like glitter and reminders and gamification and whatever to try to get them to do it more. And like rewards and gold stars. And if you're spending your time like manipulating people, as I see it, by finding out what type of gold stars will get them to do stuff, I think you're not going to spread your ideas very effectively because that person's not really that into it. There's also ways that people pressure students. Schools do a lot of pressuring. And if you have to pressure someone to get them to learn something, then that's not going to work great. So what you really want is people who come to you and have some questions and are actually saying things on their own initiative. They actually will do something. And at that point, it makes a lot more sense to help them. There's a lot of stuff that they try to make the learning process like really smooth and elegant and no friction and really easy and really like step by step and organized, and they're trying to make it so easy for people. And I think some of that polish is not really that important, because if the person actually cares that much, they're going to be persistent and they're not going to be stopped by little tiny bumps in the road. Like when I try to learn something, I don't get stuck just because the educational materials were not super polished. I'm not going to let that stop me. So I'm more interested in providing a lot of material that someone who's really interested could look through and find what they want and get answers, rather than spending more time editing and polishing to provide some more shiny material that seems nice to people, but someone who actually cared that much like wouldn't need those little minor fixes very much. So some of the problems with sharing values or whatever, educating people, that I found is most people, like, they just don't actually care that much about learning. They're not that into it. They don't really want to put the effort in. They just sort of leave and get bored or just never do much. And if you're a bit more pushy and like point out how they have a bunch of bad ideas and if they don't change, they're harming their life, and good ideas are important and urgent and make a difference in life. If you say that kind of stuff, a lot of people get offended and they just leave. But there's very few scenarios where most people actually do much to learn. And a lot of the people who try to learn, they think they're much smarter and knowledgeable than they are, and then they start losing arguments and they can't keep up in the argument, and they don't want to go read books or do like major side projects to fill in the gaps in their knowledge, and they just can't deal with the discussion, and they're not very rigorous or precise. They're just making a constant stream of errors, and they don't want to deal with that. They just give up. But they will. It's very hard to get someone who will, for example, pause the debate and learn grammar so that they can start building up their skill level so that they can actually have the debate better. FI has been a very long-term project, and the people doing grammar is actually progress, because for many years I was telling people that they need to practice the basics and build up and making various suggestions, and I've finally gotten more people to actually do more when I provided the grammar essay, that people found that actually accessible and helpful and something they wanted to do, as opposed to many of my previous suggestions, which most people did not want to do, such as speedrunning. Although just has been speedrunning Mario Odyssey, so I eventually got someone to try that. I don't know what like experience in blocks mean. I think your experience like individual moments is a better approximation, like, or individual events or whatever. It doesn't like automatically group it. Life doesn't group itself together for you. You have to use your mind to think about how to group your life data and experience together into useful categories and groupings. There's not only one way to group it. You can have multiple different groupings that are useful for different purposes. They can give you a different perspective on your life. Why then does society group aging into categories as a natural phenomenon? Because of culture. Like, there's just standard views on life in our culture. People find them useful, or they spread for whatever reason. Not everything that spreads in our culture is useful, but maybe people find it useful. Like, I think that those categories are very secondary, like childhood and young adult and career man and retired elderly person and whatever. Like, we have those categories because we have those phases of life. People actually live that way. They follow that pattern of life. So many people do that it's useful to have terms to refer to it. Those phases are overrated in various ways, including retirement. Like, you shouldn't be living your life now just for the goal of one day you're just not going to do much. You should be trying to make your life like good in an ongoing basis where you wouldn't want to retire from your life or like quit your career. Like you should be doing something you actually like. Would be better. A lot of people when they retire they get like really bored. And so they saved all this money and then they don't really know what to do with it because they've never had a life that they liked. And then they start trying to have that when they're like already 65. And it doesn't work very well. There's good posts about retirement by PAS on FI list in the archives. I think we've talked about it a few times. Well, why do you want to retire instead of building more stuff? Like, Thomas Sawes kept writing his stuff about psychiatry into his 90s. Like, why would he stop doing that? I don't plan to be like, all right, I finished my philosophy career, and now I'm just going to spend 30 years going on yacht cruises or whatever before I die. Well, if you do things that use the mind, then you should still be physically able to do them to some extent. If your career was just manual labor and didn't involve thinking, and you were never able to transition into management or whatever, then retirement's not going to solve your problem and suddenly make you a thoughtful person with an examined life. Yeah, Aubrey's book, Ending Aging, he talked about like the different sources of damage that are like threats to your life. And so he had different ideas about how to solve each of the problems, and he had arguments for why he thought the 7, however many categories, was like a complete exhaustive list, and if we solved all of those, we'd be sort of like done instead of finding 10 more. I liked that book a lot, Ending Aging. By the way, I talked with Aubrey de Grey at length, and it is on the ebooks page on my blog. I don't know if you've seen it, but sadly, I found that basically he's not open to course corrections or criticism, and he's making some mistakes, and there's nothing I can do about it. Even though my life is at stake, I gave up on helping him. We talked about cryo at the beginning of the discussion, but that was not the bulk of it. A lot of it was about philosophy. But like I wrote an open letter to Sens, you can find on my blog or in that ebook, pointed out some of the ways they're running the organization badly. They do like donation matching, and they do a lot of stuff where they present their organization as if they're any other charity instead of differentiating themselves properly. And not just any other charity, but sort of like a lower tier one that doesn't really have their shit together. Aubrey also is like left-wing statist, wants government funding, not just for research, which is bad enough, but also for like distribution of medicine. This goes through some of the issues with Sens. And there's also a further criticism, and yeah, Aubrey was kind of dishonest about their openness to suggestions and the activity of their forum. He pretended that their subreddit is actually active or means anything. There's really no mechanisms to help Sens intellectually with ideas. Like maybe if you're like a specialist scientist, there's some mechanism where you can tell them something, but not in general. Aubrey will not address like donation matching or how they run their newsletter badly or why their website is socially signaling that they're unserious. And like he discussed with me, he wrote me like 30 emails, like, but that was because he was interested in talking about it, not because he was actually going to change Sens. Most of them were not actually about changing Sens, but when I talked about that, he would not talk to me. And he didn't get the point about cryonics ever. It's really sad because we're probably going to die because of people like Aubrey being irrational in certain ways. Like, he's so much better than most people in most ways, but he has like some major weaknesses. And it's such like a close call where he could be a lot better than he is. That's what I think.